Right, joining me at the moment, I have the Associate Minister for Agriculture, the Associate Minister for Rural Development? And the
Regional
Minister
Development.
Regional Development. I should make sure I get this one right. And the Minister for Rural Communities, the Honourable Mark Patterson. Thank you very much for joining me today. First question I've got for you is a bit of a left field one. I understand that you have an old woodwork teacher who you now have to sit down and listen to again in the House. Jerry Brownlee was one of your teachers. Is that right?
Yeah, g'day Paul, good to be on. Yes, Jerry was my woodwork teacher back in the day, Mr. Brownlee at Ellesmere College.
Oh my
So
God.
he actually gave me the cane once, so I did bring that up in a speech in my previous term in Parliament.
Oh
Revenge
my
is best
God.
served cold, so yeah.
Has he apologised for that, or was there a lot more going on at the time?
Uh, well, his recollection's not quite as clear as mine on that, so I don't like to push it,
That's
but
understandable.
yeah. No,
Damn.
no,
Um,
no harm done or no bitterness towards that. He was a character as a woodwork teacher or a teacher in general, as you could imagine, and
oh yeah,
that really carried on to Parliament.
yeah. I said, does it feel like you're in school sometimes?
It certainly does. I think schools is a bit more disciplined than the Parliament on occasion, and you know, Jerry, when he was a teacher, he was prone to bellowing out and hauling us into line, and he's had to use some of those skills in Parliament as well.
Oh man, who knew that was a transferable job skill from being a teacher? Good to see
True.
that it's got a role there. Hey,
Yeah.
rural communities being your big portfolio, I'm really keen to have a chat to you about what those issues are that are facing our rural communities and how the government's going about trying to help them. At the moment, while we're talking, there's a big storm hitting a lot of them sort of down in the South Island. The West Coast, I believe, is being impacted. What do you see as being the biggest issues facing our rural communities at the moment?
Well, the role of Rural Communities Minister, we've got a small team within the Ministry for Primary Industries, MPI, that look, I guess, over whole of government, and we, I guess, rural proofing is the term. So we look at how policies are going to impact rural communities in particular, because government works in silos a little bit at times. So there's a chance that something that's being proposed isn't suitable for rural communities, or there's a cumulative effect where a number of policies coming together actually have a disproportionate impact on rural communities. So it's an advocacy role. I think there's a danger of looking at rural communities as just farming, and of course
Yeah,
that's a lot of what
that's
we
not
do.
the
That
case.
is hugely important, and those rural towns are farm servicing towns. But it's important that we look at it in the entirety, and from government services point of view, they've got good healthcare, they've got good connectivity, they've got a police presence, they've got a education, good education, all those things coming together to make viable rural communities. So it's obviously a big challenge. I mean, everything the government does affects rural communities. We've got a small team, so you've got to fight your battles. Probably the ones that I'm fighting at the moment in that broader scope, the healthcare. I'm really concerned about rural healthcare. Obviously, around the entirety of the system, it's under real pressure, but particularly acute in some of our rural communities. And the connectivity stuff as well. And you hit Paul Brislin on, I think, a
Mhm.
couple of podcasts ago, talking about exactly that. And this is where things like joined up thinking, like the winding back of the 3G network, the winding up of the copper wire, some adjustments to New Zealand Post, potentially some of the school bus stuff that's happening as well, that each of those things are a separate issue, but cumulatively it's about going to the relevant ministers and saying, actually, this is what it looks like to those constituents on the ground. So that's a bit of a flavour of what we do.
With rural communities, a lot of them are focusing around primary industries because, as you mentioned, they're service areas for people out on farms and working in those areas. The rural sector, or the primary industry sector, is our largest export by a huge amount. How much do you think the changes are that the government's bringing in at the moment around things like resource management changes, climate change mitigation factors, how much is that going to feed through and impact these rural communities?
Yeah, well, agriculture, as you say, does underpin our rural communities, and agriculture is actually on a real up at the moment. So that's really positive, and rural communities feel that first. And we'll see that we're starting to see that flow through into the GDP figures and the like. But some of that spending that starts in the rural communities, so it's good to see that happening again. The I guess on the broader issue, it isn't just about farming. Though. It's about we want the artists, the entrepreneurs, the small business people that setting up cafes and tourism operations and art studios and that sort of thing. Because actually, the narrative out there is that rural communities are kind of dying. Well, actually, they're not. They're growing again. I think since COVID, a lot of people have been wanting to reassess their life and their values and see a more connection to community that do get in those rural communities as being important. So it's a matter of making sure we've got those core government services that, so whether you're a farmer or whether you're an artist, that it's, you've got a good place to go in a rural community.
In terms of the growth of rural communities, I read a report the other day that they expect it's 25 years between Auckland and Hamilton becoming one giant megacity. There's obviously a number of rural communities that would fill in that bridge. What are the changing needs for those sort of communities that are seeing so much growth that they're bordering on becoming a much more urbanized area?
Well, that's an excellent question, Paul. In fact, we were in Canterbury the other day at Rolleston, and within 12 years, Rolleston is forecast to be the same size or bigger than Dunedin. So they were going through exactly those issues, and how do you a lot of it's around the connectivity in terms of transport corridors and how you set them up so that we're not just sitting in gridlock and the like. But we do have to get ahead of some of those. We've got to forecast it out accurately forward, so we're not just doing things in an ad hoc fashion, which I think we've been guilty of in the past in this country. So Rolleston is a place that's going through exactly those issues at the moment.
In terms of those sort of connectivity transport corridors that are there, there's roads of regional significance is one of the big plans for this government for getting those connection sort of points in place. When it comes to building those, they have impacts on those rural communities that they go past and those sort of areas that they service. Do you know how much sort of planning has gone into, look, this is going to impact this community this way, this is going to benefit this community in that way, when it comes to building those kind of connectivity transport areas?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're doing is around the freight hubs, and
Hmm.
again, just looking on the Rolleston example, they were pitching to us as regional development ministers around a freight hub, which was going to take 60,000 trucks off the road, going to Littleton, aggregating freight from the west coast and further south. So that's the kind of examples, some joined up thinking we need. And Kiwi Rail's in the room, they're saying, well, for that to happen, we've got to invest this much in our rail corridor. The next conversation is then around commuter and at what stage does that become viable and how do we work that into future planning.
Um, how much of a change then are you looking at for an area like Rolleston in terms of the economy building of having something like a hub like that there?
All those sort of things are key enablers. So it's not just a hub for freight to get stuff off the road. It's actually then you start to get the manufacturing bases and the cool stores and the like aggregate up around those areas as well. So in terms of, you talked about the carbon thing before, in terms of efficiency and decarbonising processes, they become very it's a real efficiency metric that helps with some of those challenges. Energy is another one that we have to have a forward look at. How we're going to power some of these industries and communities as they get bigger. So yeah, it's a lot of joined up thinking required there.
Is that the same for your sort of power infrastructure that you get to your rural communities? I grew up in the middle of the Waikato where, one storm and suddenly you've got no power because there's no backup way of getting the lines through. Is there much future proofing going on in that area at the moment?
Well, I think you're seeing, like one of the aims of the fast track legislation is to enable quicker rollout of wind and solar and some of those renewable projects. Obviously, had a little bit of a setback in down south there a week or two back, so that's not always straightforward. But actually, one of the revolutions I think that's coming, it's not necessarily government's got a role to play in this from a regulatory point of view, but the rooftop solar, farms actually are going to become energy exporters, and we're starting to see that sort of leading edge farmers getting into this now, where they're not only providing power for themselves, but they're putting power back into the grids, and that's going to build quite a bit of resilience. The economics of that are starting to become quite compelling. I'm sure you've just about everyone in New Zealand's heard of Mike Casey from Rewiring
Hmm.
Aotearoa, who's been a really active lobbyist, him and his group, and just alluding to the opportunities that sit within this to augment the broader power system. So yeah, I mean, there's not just one answer, but it's enabling a whole lot of answers to come through.
We're a little bit behind when it comes to solar, especially if you duck over the ditch and check out Australia. Everybody seems to have solar panels on their roof. Is that kind of encouragement that Australia has, where I think they were subsidising people with new builds if they put solar on it? Is that something that we could look at rolling out here?
Yeah, well, I think we're about 3% penetration, and they're at 40%. So they're
Hmm.
miles. They're at least a decade ahead of us. Obviously, they probably get a bit more sun, so it probably makes it a bit easier. But I think the stuff that Mike's been pitching is around just some of the regulatory stuff. So there's not actually a government subsidy involved. We just have to enable the market to work a bit better and for a fair price to be paid for the power going back into the grid. And there's massive implications for, maybe we don't have to build the massive power lines and pylons and main grid. We could do a lot more of it locally. That's like I've always thought Mike's had some really important things to say, and we've tried to help him amplify his voice here in Parliament.
He's got some brilliant ideas. I had chat to him about 6 months ago, and yeah, really, really good ideas, and basically making ourselves less reliant on everybody else and becoming a little bit more self-sufficient in that respect. Speaking of international, though, I'm talking to you on Thursday morning. Donald Trump's announced his what do they call retaliatory tariffs, and put a 10% general tariff on New Zealand imports to the United States. Last year, the US became our second biggest export partner, and the majority of that comes from agriculture, primary industries. I realize it's very, very early days. But is there a general view that you've come across so far about how this might impact our agriculture sector and our rural communities?
Yes, well, as you say, at the time of recording, it's only about half an hour. I've only
Mm.
just headlines myself, so I better be careful in leading the government response here. But obviously, we'll be really disappointed about that. We would have hoped to have escaped that. We have virtually no tariffs ourselves, but we are operating in a dramatically different geopolitical situation. It's sort of unfolding before our eyes. So we're collateral damages as everyone else in this environment. We will have to roll with it. In the first instance, in terms of the rural communities and the farming underpinning them, big market for beef, dairy, wine. So $9 billion, I think most of that primary exports. So that's going to have a material impact. The the extraordinary part of this is like there's a real shortage of beef worldwide, particularly in America. Their herd numbers the lowest in 7 or 8 years. So beef prices are at a record. So they're just putting another tax on top of that, which will probably flow. Most of it will be paid by the American consumer, I would imagine, because they really need our beef at the moment. So yeah, it'll be a fluid situation. Hopefully, it'll be something that might be wound back in not
Does
too distant.
this does this offer us opportunities in other markets?
Yeah, well, I guess we don't really want to be seen to be benefiting. Um, that's not the narrative we want. I mean, obviously, we
Hmm.
don't want those tariffs to be on in the first place. But yeah, there'll be a reordering of world trade, and if there's reciprocal tariffs go on American product going into the likes of China or the EU, then maybe we pick up some extra business there. So New Zealand exporters have been diversifying their export base over a fair period of time. Actually, ironically, probably gravitating towards the United States. We were pretty reliant on China. I think everyone recognised that was a little bit of a risk to be too top heavy there, and so they've done a really good job. So I guess we're probably as well prepared as we could be.
In terms of those impacts that are going to come through to those rural communities, I imagine it's not going to be an instant impact, but what sort of long-term impacts might these communities be facing from those increased costs for importing to the States?
Yeah, well, it could have reduction with the immediate start. There could be an immediate reduction in the schedules, which of course impacts farmers' cash flows, and then that flows through. So but it's not actually clear at the moment who's going to bear these costs because it's actually the importer that pays them. So whether they'll be passed through, New Zealand exporters are in a pretty strong position at the moment. So we'll wait and see. We won't catastrophise this. Obviously,
Mhm.
there's a number of other countries that appear to have come off much worse. But yeah, it's concerning, and it's just something we haven't had to deal with for probably 30 years being in this sort of environment. So maybe more.
Speaking of things that we used to deal with, wool was once our biggest export product. I see, as it last weekend, you were head of the muster in Te Kuiti for
Yeah.
the running of the sheep. What sort of future do you see for wool as a product for the country and how it would help our communities?
Yeah, well, I've got a delegation to help revive the wool industry, which I'm very motivated by. It used to underpin our, basically built the country as an economy, as a commodity. And it's an incredible natural fibre. The good news is there is a swing back to natural fibres more broadly. So we are starting to see an uptick in demand, new types of end uses. So it's not just carpet and insulation. So we're starting to see the price come up. It's got a lot further to go, but it was very, very dire for a period of time. In fact, it was a cost to farm. It was costing more to shear the sheep than they were getting in wool returns. But there is a lot of stuff going on. There's some capital coming in. We're doing our bit as government. We've co-invested in a number of sort of startup initiatives. We're going to be making an announcement very shortly around our wool and government buildings policy. So we'll be adding to some demand. That's already happening anecdotally. And yeah, so we're throwing the kitchen sink at it, quite literally helping re-establish a wool industry, hopefully bringing a manufacturing base back here too. So we're not just we're adding value and creating jobs in our regions as well. And the trade deals that we're doing, and particularly potentially with India, is really exciting opportunity for wool as well.
With wool, what is the like natural fibers, all that kind of stuff? What's the impact of that on the environment itself? Is it a low impact type of activity? Because wool is obviously a natural product. You're not paying for um, you know factories to spew out oils and pollutants to produce wool. What kind of environmental impacts are we looking at on growing that industry?
As I said before, wool's actually it's a miracle fibre. It's biodegradable by some measure, and one of the key metrics is its carbon neutrality, and by some measure, carbon negative. There's growing concern around microplastics.
Hmm.
The synthetic products often have these PFAS toxic chemicals that are needed to treat them, so wool doesn't need that. It's non-allergenic. It's there's a laundry list of properties that wool has that you just could not design um, synthetically. And it's starting to get on consumers' radars. They're looking for these types of products. A stat I heard the other day: 148,000 tonnes of carpet goes into landfills every year,
Oh,
and the
wow.
majority, 148,000 tonnes. So that is, and the synthetic component of that, which is probably 80% wool, it'll take 1,000 years to break down, whereas the wool will just, decompose back into carbon and soil carbon over just a few years. So there's a huge environmental advantages through using wool and actually other natural products that you can add to it, like hemp and harakiki, and so the natural fibres space is really exciting. I think we're going to see a real revival.
Is it an area that you think New Zealanders are aware of the potential of?
No, and I mentioned the harakiki thing because I think that that was obviously, if you go back 120 years or something, that was probably 150 years. It was a big industry here. They're now making carbon fibre. Hayden Paddon's rally car, for example, is made out of harakiki.
Oh,
So it's a carbon fibre replacement. It's stronger than and than the synthetic versions, and totally natural. So we're going to see a revival of a number of these industries, not just because of the environmental stuff, but actually some of the properties are superior to anything that we can manufacture synthetically.
that sounds amazing. I had no idea about the cars. That's brilliant. That is so cool.
Well, and
Last,
apparently, just go on with that. Apparently, carbon fibre is a $2 trillion industry worldwide.
oh,
You wouldn't
wow.
have to get a big slice of that pie to have a really substantial industry re-emerge. There's an outfit called Kiwi Fibre in Christchurch. Go and have a look them up. They're doing some extraordinary stuff, and that's just a glimpse of what the future might hold.
So, last question for you then, and again, it's a really hard one for you. What's your record for shearing a sheep?
Well, I went to the New Zealand Shearing Champs on Saturday night, Te Kuwiti, and by crikey, I would have embarrassed myself up there. Those guys are incredible. Toa Henderson that won the open final, short 25 sheep in under 20 minutes. So I might have knocked out a couple in that time, especially in my current state, and not particularly practiced. So there's several orders of magnitude between me and Toa Henderson.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really informative. I've really appreciated it.
Thanks, Paul, for the opportunity.
Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.